Okay, so I reopened the homework folders. Basically, I just went and reopened all of them. Were people able to get stuff uploaded? Okay, good. All right, excellent. So I should have all of that graded for you by Thursday afternoon. In addition, right, so you're going to be doing try this exercise on page 206, it'll be due Wednesday night, so I'll grade that on Thursday morning as well. And what you're going to be doing is evaluating a set of thesis statements, and you're going to be looking for tension in them. You will know what that means by the end of this class period, right? And you're going to be reading the next 10 pages and writing analytically. Basically, you're just finishing up chapter 7. So next time we're going to be talking about, well, whatever we don't finish today, plus introductions and conclusions, and how to recognize and fix weak thesis statements. But today our focus is going to be on developing a thesis statement, right? So it's going to it's going to grow directly out of what we were doing last time, and we're going to do some practice in a little while with the information we were looking at last time. But before we get started with this, does anybody have any questions about homework, about assignments, about what's coming, about anything at all? Yeah, Colby.
Do you have an extra copy of that out? I know looking for it.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. It's more important that you have it than that I have it. Okay. Other questions? Okay, so last thing I want to note before we get started is that after this, we're going to be putting writing analytically aside for a little while, right? Don't sell it, because don't sell it back to the bookstore, because we're going to come back to it. But next week, we're going to be starting on the Voltaire, right, on Candide. Has everybody been able to get a copy of that? Okay, good. Because, again, like the bookstore's been real iffy, like worse than usual iffy this semester, so I just wanted to make sure that everybody managed to acquire it. Okay, great. And so yeah, we'll talk about expectations for that next time, and I will also give you the assignment sheet for the first major paper next time. Mostly, don't freak out; it's not coming due that soon, right? But I just want everybody to know that it's coming and to understand what it is that you have to do, and to shape your reading habits with the Voltaire and the Rousseau to the needs of that paper, right? Okay, great. So, hold the damn eraser. So, you all took 1101, right? You must have, or you wouldn't be here. So, what did y'all do about thesis development in 1101? What do you remember about what a thesis is, and how to come up with one and how to develop one through a paper? Yeah, Colby.
It's usually one or two sentences.
Okay.
Statement.
Yeah, usually a single sentence, doesn't have to be, right? And where do we usually place it?
At the end of the first paragraph.
It usually comes at the end of the first paragraph, right? This is not a hard and fast rule. It's just usually a convenient place for it, right? And what is the thesis, like, what's its function? What does it do? What is it?
It kind of sums up
Yeah, you're forecasting to the reader, right? Essentially what the major argument you're going to be making is, right? So a good thesis needs to be three things. It needs to be arguable. It needs to be sufficiently narrow, and it needs to be reductive. So let me explain what I mean by all three of these, right? So when we talk about arguable, right, I really mean three things by that. So a thesis that is arguable is one that is, first, not immediately obvious to anyone who's looking at the same data that you are, right? It can't just be a surface level literal interpretation of whatever your data is. Right? So if you for example, you come up with as a thesis, Romeo and Juliet is about young love, right? So no shit, right? No one's going to dispute that. So that wouldn't be an arguable thesis. You would need to think about the way it presents young love, maybe, in a way that's not obvious to anyone who reads or watches the play. Okay, so it's got to be something that's not immediately obvious. Second, it has to be something that is supported by evidence. Right? Why can't you make the claim that in Romeo and Juliet, the protagonists behave the way they do because they are mind controlled by space aliens?
And no evidence for it.
Yeah, there are no space aliens in the play, right? There is no evidence in the play that suggests that they are being controlled by space aliens, right? So your interpretation has to be plausible, right? It has to be supported by actual concrete details that you observe in the data or in the text that you're looking at, right? And it also needs to be open to alternative explanations. Right? It has to be something that another reader looking at the same data or the same text could disagree with. Right? Because essentially what you're doing when you're writing an argumentative essay is making the case for why this text or this data should be interpreted the way you're interpreting it, right? And there's no point in doing that if there's only one way to interpret this text, right? So it has to be something with which another reasonable person might disagree. So any questions about what I mean by an arguable thesis? Okay, so just a quick review, right? Something's not immediately obvious, supported by concrete evidence, needs to be something someone else could disagree with, right? Okay, so when we talk about a narrow thesis, right? If you are trying to write, say, an 8-page paper on Romeo and Juliet, and you try to cover everything that happens in all 5 acts of the play, how good is that paper going to be?
Not very.
Right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking the question, right? Yeah, it's going to be shit, right? Because it's going to be incoherent because you're trying to cram too much into too small a space, right? So this is why you want your thesis to be narrow, right? You want to focus on a very specific pattern of details that you find in your source, right? So, you may, for example, decide to, focus on, say, physical descriptions of beauty in Romeo and Juliet. and try to make an argument about that, right? You might maybe pick up on references to religion in Romeo and Juliet and try to make an argument about what that means, right? My point being is that you have to pick up maybe even if we want to talk about a binary rather than a strand, right? Maybe different expectations of male and female behavior, right? As they're depicted in the play. But my point being, right, is that you want to pick one relatively narrow idea, right? One pattern of details that you think hold together pretty well and that you can interpret and stick with that, right? You're going to get a lot more mileage out of that. You're going to get a much better paper if you can focus on something relatively small than if you try to cover everything. And finally, what we mean by productive here, right? A productive thesis is one that gives the paper a logical structure. So it's probably useful, I find it useful anyway, to think of a good thesis statement as being kind of like your spine. What does your spine do? Why do we have a spine? What's that?
To support our body.
Yeah, it supports the body, right? And how is the spine related to everything, to the rest of our skeletal structure? Yeah, it holds everything together, holds everything up, right? Right? Without a spine, we wouldn't be able to stand, we wouldn't be able to walk, right? So think of a good thesis as being kind of like that, right? It's a sentence that holds all of the content of the paper together, and all of the subsequent paragraphs are going to be like bones or limbs coming off of that spine, right? They all have to come back to that original spine in one way. And one way that you can do this is by treating the paper almost like a kind of science experiment, right? So do y'all know how the scientific method works? Have you had that in class? Okay, Michaela, you're nodding. What's the scientific method? Tell me about it. You made eye contact and you nodded. What are the stages in the scientific method?
I think you come up with, I think you do observation and hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
then experiment.
Yep. Right, this is basically it, right? Although you should be going back and doing this whole process a couple of times before you reach a conclusion, right? And if you think about the paragraphs in your paper, right, as fulfilling a similar function, right? So I make an observation, right? The claim in this paragraph is my hypothesis, right? This is what I think is happening. You test it against a piece of evidence. And then, you see, okay, do I still think this is what's happening, right? So treat every paragraph in the paper as a kind of test of this thesis, right? And what should happen as you go through each piece of evidence, your thesis will get more specific and more refined, right? So essentially it will develop over the course of the paper, right? Now, you are also going to want, generally, to write a thesis in two parts. Right, so there's a structure that the textbook calls seems to be about X, could really be about Y. That's actually a really good, strong format for a thesis statement. Because essentially what you're doing is showing in the thesis that there's another plausible interpretation, right, that you are reacting to. So, if we, for example, go to the data sheet that I gave you last time, right? So we noticed that, like, what's the big thing that everything on that sheet is about? If you need, what's that?
Transportation.
Well, is transportation actually the main thing that everything there is about?
Infrastructure.
Okay, yeah. So planning, urban planning infrastructure, right? Yeah. So we can say that this isn't like how we would formulate the thesis specifically, right? But this is we're just kind of putting X and Y together here, right? So seems to be about urban planning, but we could say is really about, since there's so much about roads and cars and public transit, right, that it's really about transportation. So what we'd want to do then is try to think about what we think all of this data is saying about transportation, right? So we're going to want to look at the way it deals with different kinds of transportation. How does it deal with public transit? How does it deal with cars? How does it deal with pedestrians or bicycles, right? And what's the relationship there to the way our communities are laid out and planned, right? And I'm going to kind of leave this sitting here for a minute because we're going to come back to this and you're going to try to come up with a thesis based on this, right? But I can also give you an example based on film here. So how many of you have seen the movie Alien?
What's it about?
What is Alien about? Okay, so you've got basically these kind of truckers in space. Their spaceship receives a distress signal from a planet. It wakes everybody up. They go and they land on the planet. They find these eggs. A face sucker thing jumps out and breaches the first mate's spacesuit.
I feel like I have.
Okay, it sounds familiar. It sounds familiar to you? Okay.
I've seen the newer two.
Okay. So you're at least familiar with some of the concepts here, right? So basically what happens in that first movie, right, is so they bring the first mate back to the ship. Because his spacesuit's been breached, the rules say they can't let him back onto the ship, right? So the warrant officer, the official on the ship who was the member of the crew who's supposed to enforce the rules, says, no, we have to leave him outside. We can't bring him in. The science officer goes over her head and opens the doors anyway, lets him back in. And in so doing, releases the creature that has burrowed into the first mate's body and pops out of his chest in a very, very dramatic scene sort of mid-movie, right? And then the rest of the film involves the members of the crew first trying to find and capture or kill this thing, and then the survivors trying to escape the ship, right? So one thing that we might note about this film is that at least superficially, it looks like a science fiction movie, right? It has a lot of the features of science fiction, right? So, it takes place on a spaceship, right? There are robots and computers, right? Alien life forms, right? Future setting. and so on and so forth, right? Now, one other thing that I notice about this, though, is that it also has a lot of the features of a horror movie from the same era, right? You've got jump scares. Right? The creature has a habit of hiding in dark places and then jumping out at people, right? You know, when they least expect it. You've got right, a good deal of violence. And you've also got that pattern, I think when we talked about horror movies before as a genre, right? You know, there's that pattern where characters who follow the rules survive and characters who break the rules die. The same thing happens here, right? The only character who survives is the warrant officer, who's the one who didn't want to let the damn thing on the ship in the first place, right? So we could start to make the case here that, you know, while Alien features several trappings of a science fiction film, its actual plot more closely resembles a horror film. And then what I would do with this initial broad thesis, right, is in each paragraph test this idea against these various pieces of evidence that I've drawn from the film, right? You know, take specific scenes, specific moments, specific elements of the film, and see how well they either advance or force me to revise this thesis, right? So one thing we should notice here about this seems to be about X is really about Y structure is also the way we phrase it, right? So we've got one idea, right, that is a perfectly viable idea that we're just using to provide back pressure, right? That we're just using as a jumping off point for our own idea. And then we've got the thing that we're actually trying to argue. So, which of these two clauses is the thing we're actually trying to argue? Yeah, the horror film part, right? Whereas the science fiction film part is what's providing the back pressure. It's the other idea we're using as a foil. So the way you can tell, or one way you can tell which idea is which, is again by just looking at the structure of the sentence and determining which is an independent and which is a subordinate clause. Do we all know what the difference is between an independent and a subordinate clause? Is this something that's familiar or no? Okay, Colby, what's the difference?
An independent clause stands up by itself, but a subordinate clause has to be with an independent clause.
Yes, that's exactly right. So an independent clause is a clause in a sentence that could stand on its own as a sentence. Right? A subordinate clause cannot. It has to be connected to an independent clause, right? So if there's a subordinate clause, that is always going to be your back pressure idea, right? The X. And the independent clause is going to be your actual argument, the Y. So note here that the back pressure idea here, while alien features several trappings, etc., right? It's a prepositional phrase. It starts with while, right? So if we separate this into two sentences, while alien features several trappings of a science fiction film, is that a complete sentence? If we just put a period there? It is not, right? So yeah, so we could tell, even if we didn't already know, we could tell this was our back pressure idea, right? So that is one quick and easy way you can tell where the tension is in the thesis statement, right? So which is the back pressure idea, which is the main idea. So let's try to work a little bit on developing one together. Okay, so none of you have seen Alien, or at least none of you can recall specifically seeing Alien. How many of you have seen Titanic? Okay, right. I use this as an example not because I think it's a particularly good movie, but because it's something that just about everybody has seen. Okay. So, tell me a little bit about Titanic. What's it about?
Well, it's about this ship. It was a very rare ship. They ended up crashing.
Yes. Okay. And then, yeah, that's the historical event. That's the backdrop, right? Yes, the supposedly unsinkable ship, right, departs from Europe. It's sailing across the Atlantic to New York. It's an iceberg, and it's going too fast, and it sinks, right? Is the movie mostly concerned, though, with what happens to the ship? What's the primary plot of the movie? Yeah. It's mostly a love story, right? And how do we get to that love story? Is that what we start with? Does anybody remember how the movie starts? Even before then, even before we get to the love, does the movie actually start in the past?
No.
Yeah, it starts in the present with that salvage crew, right? Who are going through the wreckage of the ship, and they're digging up stuff that they find, oh hey, some of this stuff actually connects to, living survivors of the wreck, right? So let's contact them and bring them in and interview them for this film we're making, right? And that's how they find this woman, Rose, right? They find, I think a locket and a naked picture of her, right? Yeah, and that's kind of the jumping off point then for her story, right? So the fact that we start off with a salvage crew that's looking for artifacts, and then they interview this very old woman, she's now a very old woman, right, about her experiences, right? What might that suggest as a direction we might take for what the movie's actually about? Where does the rest of the movie then really take place? In the past, but whose past? Yeah, so we could also say that this is a movie about memory, right? Because it's our view of these events is entirely filtered through Rose's memory of them, right? So let's then think about this love story that she is a part of, right? Who's the other side of this love story? What do we know about him? Jack. Can you get a more generic dude name, right? Jack. Okay. And let's kind of pick apart these two different characters, right? What's Jack like? What do we know about Jack?
Lower class.
Yes. Yes. He is, I guess we could, charitably call him, like a vagabond, right? Someone of no fixed permanent address. So yeah, so Jack is on the socioeconomic ladder 4. What else do we know about him?
He won the ticket for a poker match.
Okay, yeah, so he's only there by chance, right? Right, it's just kind of a random coincidence that he ends up on the ship at all. Right, yeah, he wins the ticket by gambling. Okay, good. What else do we know? What does he, to the extent that he does anything for a living, what does he do? Or does he have any particular special skills or talents? He's an artist, yes. Yes, right. Rose tells him, to draw me like one of your French girls, right? Hence the source of the remarkably well-preserved naked portrait that the salvage crew finds decades later, right? What else? Like just about his personality, his character. Like what else do we note about this guy? Just like personality traits.
He was kind of free-spirited.
I'm sorry, a little louder.
He was kind of free-spirited.
Okay. Okay, yeah, he's free-spirited, unconventional, right? Does what feels good in the moment. And what about Rose? Let's talk a little bit about Rose. What's Rose like? If Jack is poor, Rose is, yeah. We eventually find out that she doesn't actually have any money, right? The family is just, the family's lost its fortune. She's pretending to be rich to try to catch a husband, right? So, we can, at the very least, say, even if not actually rich, right, she's grown up privileged. What else do we note about Rose in comparison to Jack?
Wasn't she on her way to like her aunt or something?
Yeah, well, I don't remember if she's going to visit an aunt, but who's she traveling with? There are two. She's traveling with her mother, right? And who else? Is she as free as Jack is?
Her fiance.
Yeah, she's engaged to this real piece of shit, right? So yeah, so she's she's traveling with family, and with her asshole fiance. And they really lean into, like, James Cameron is really good at not giving his villains any redeeming qualities. I'll just say that about the fiance, right? So what, in terms of Rose's personality, how does she differ from Jack? Okay, certainly, more sheltered, right? Yeah, maybe more conservative, less willing to take risks. And how do these two actually meet each other? Well, they bump into each other in a very specific way. What is she about to do when they meet? Does anybody recall?
About to jump off the boat.
Yeah. Basically, he stops her from committing suicide, right? He happens to show up at the moment when she's about to jump off the ship, right, and talk her down. So, would these two, hold out your arms, so would these two have been as likely to meet on land Yeah, so okay, so the ship seems to be what brought them together here, right? The fact that they're on this kind of closed floating world that, you know, is that nobody can leave except by jumping off. So our initial thesis, right, if we were taking an initial stab at this, might look something like this, right? So Titanic how was I going to phrase this? So, like this. In Titanic, the ship is a separate world in which the normal social barriers don't apply. So, how well does that fit what we've unpacked here so far? Let's see what happens if we try to apply a little bit more evidence to it, right? So, how does Rose's family treat Jack even after he has saved her life?
Like trash.
Yeah, they invite him to dinner and basically just humiliate him, right? Meanwhile, when he takes her down below to dance with all the Irish immigrants, right? How well does she really fit in there? Right? She has fun, right? But it's all kind of treated as like, oh, isn't this an interesting experience for this, sheltered rich girl, right? It's clear like this is not her world, right? They're nice to her, a lot nicer to her than her family is to Jack, but it's clear that she doesn't really belong there, right? And what about the end of the film? Who gets to live and who has to die? Yeah, despite the fact that that is a very, very big door, right? Could easily fit another body on it, right? He dies in the frozen water and Rose lives, right? Now, how does that relate to the bigger issue of who survives and who dies on the ship? What's the big problem on the ship? Because it was supposed to be unsinkable, what didn't they provide enough of?
Lifeboat.
Yeah, they didn't think they needed them, right? So because there aren't enough lifeboats, who gets first crack at them?
Women and children.
Ah, but which women and children?
The rich.
Yes. The women and children get the lifeboats, but only the ones who paid for the pricey tickets, right? The people with the cheap tickets down below get locked down below. So any kind of nods here to class equality kind of get erased by a lot of the way we actually see socioeconomic class providing people with special privileges here, right? And indeed, the fact that the rich girl survives and the poor boy dies suggests that the film values who more?
The rich.
Yeah, that it values the rich girl more than it values the poor boy, right? And I think this kind of gets us back to the memory issue as well, right? Whose perspective on these events are we getting? Yeah, all we're seeing, right, is Rose's view of what happened, right? Rose's memory of what happened. So we're given the perspective of a character who is naturally going to privilege her own experience, right? Because we can't help that. That's just a thing human beings do. So each of these pieces of evidence we're applying to this original thesis, right, can be developed into a paragraph with its own claim that revises this original thesis until we get to something more specific, right? So what we end up with, if we keep going in this direction, is maybe something more like, how might we phrase this? So something like, despite I can't even spell Titanic today. Titanic's nods to socioeconomic equality the fact that the entire film takes place in a rich woman's memory or memories leads us to question how much it actually values the perspectives of the poor. And with a little bit more like work and time and finagling, we could come up with something better than this. This is just kind of my quick and dirty stab at building a thesis out of all this on the fly, right? When you are doing this, you will, I hope, be working in a quiet place with few distractions and time and space to work, right? But what I would like to do now is get back to the handout that I gave you all last time. And I want you to try doing some of this yourself. So the first thing I want you to do is try to come up with 3 seems to be about X is really about Y statements with that data set that you have. And to have maybe a couple of different, and by a couple I mean at least 3 different data points you can use to support that, right? And then when we have them, we're going to try to work together to develop them into thesis statements, right? And Colby, why don't you go sit with them again? The 3 of you can actually work together on this, right? You can help each other out. But yeah, so let's say take 15 minutes. We'll give you more time if you end up needing it. And see how many of these seems to be about X is really about Y statements you can come up with. I will be back in just a minute.
So last time, we basically just trying to find connections between
remember that the seams part doesn't always have to be the same thing either, right? And in fact, you can keep questioning even the seems to be at X is really about Y statements you come up with. It's like, well, maybe this seems to be a pedestrian safety, but it's really about something more specific, right?
And then you said to put the points that prove that are evident.
Yeah. Make sure you can connect it to points of evidence. Yeah. And remember that you always want to give me that warrant too, right? You know, the logic that connects your evidence to the claim you're making.
I guess as a warrant. These are all problems that can be solved by multiple cities.
Which ones did you use as evidence?
We rarely have sidewalks in Alaska on the other side.
Yeah, for the first one, you could the cities in the average room level room could be and from 1960 to 1990s. Let's say about the newer design was done. And then about the garages and about retail and commercial development. I was thinking about real estate. Okay, for the second question about the thesis, well, when they say about real estate, because it talks a lot about, they don't want something with their homes, about how the bank can give them loans, your net financial worth, and stuff like that. But I don't know what I would put for the first one.
because I'm going to let you figure out how to phrase it, but yeah, you've actually picked up on a good pattern there.
The part about the net financial residential real estate. It was on 14. And then the bank.
I guess you could say, one points out negatives about suburban life. It's actually about positive things you can do with real estate.
So you got 2 minutes. Do y'all feel like you want a little bit more time to come up with stuff?
We got 3.
Okay.
Maybe we got.
Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. Just take the new 10. Takes the next 2 minutes and see if you can come up with anything else. And we'll talk.
You know what the phone said there? What was you gonna say?
So because yeah, time is everything. I just kind of heard the last thing y'all were saying. It sounds like you could probably phrase that as something like seems to be about urban planning, but is really about wealth disparities. Okay. So what else did y'all come up with? You said you had already come up with 3, right? So tell me what you got and give me your logic.
Okay, well, one of we came up was seems to be about the negative aspects of suburban life, but could really be about real estate and the positive aspects of home values.
Okay.
And the evidence that we came up with that one would be the part about borrowing money from the bank against current market value.
Mm-hmm.
While urban neighborhoods and traditional downtown usually been included as commercial neighborhood and residential real estate, while in suburban neighborhoods, different land use are strictly separated by zone laws.
Uh-huh.
The part where they were like, for those who own their own home, the value of the home usually makes up a larger portion of the net financial worth. And the part where they didn't want new building, bigger homes and stuff.
Okay, so there's probably another way you could phrase that too. Maybe something like seems to be about housing is really about wealth generation. But yeah, no, yeah, that's a good pattern, and those things are all connected, and I think, yeah, you did a good job recognizing that. What else you got?
While it seems to be about urban planning, it shows evidence to support like the building of walkable cities.
Okay.
Point evidence I use is cities rarely use sidewalks nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
The average adult spends 2.5 weeks per year sitting in traffic.
Uh-huh.
And they road design after 1950 prioritizes speed over pedestrian safety.
Okay.
It's sort of all because the idea of a walkable city is to completely eliminate cars, like Atlantic City Boardwalk in Disney World. Because if you take the Disney part out of Disney World,
right,
it's just a huge, profitable, walkable city.
Yeah. Although, like, is Disney World a place? Are Disney World, the Atlantic City Boardwalk places where anyone lives?
No.
They're places where we vacation, right? So you could maybe you can maybe kind of like point to that as like an ideal, right? It's like it seems like ideally we don't actually want to have to drive everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
You could use those to make that kind of case. Yeah, but no, good. That's good. So you said you had 3. What else have you got?
Seems to be about transportation, but it's really about the evolution of suburban areas.
Okay.
And the evidence, while older American towns and cities are settled according to grid patterns in which multiple walking or driving routes can be used to reach the same destination at the same time, new city and suburbs tend to be designed as cul-de-sacs that empty out into a single free road.
Okay.
And then in the average of new American home, the garage is as large as the living space.
Mm-hmm.
And from the 1960s and 1990s, retail and commercial development moved from traditional centralized downtowns to highways, strip malls, industrial parks, and shopping.
Okay. So then I think what you would probably need to do then to take it to the next step, right, is think about like what kind of comment it's making on like the kind of transition from urban living patterns to suburban living patterns, right? What does this data lead us to believe about this transition? Okay, no, this is all good stuff, guys. Like you're all doing a really good job with this data set. So what I would like you to do now, and this is going to take us to the end of our time because I promised I'd let you go 5 minutes early because we started 5 minutes early. I want you to take the next 10 minutes. I want you to pick one of these. It doesn't have to be yours. If you like somebody else's better. And I want you to try to free write your way to a thesis here, right? So try to take this information, do what we did earlier with the Titanic stuff and the alien stuff, right? And try to write one of these seems to be about X is really about Y statements to something that might be an arguable thesis. 2 minutes, start trying to bring yourself to some kind of conclusion. Okay, so that's time. So stop what you're doing. We're going to call it here today, and bring these back to talk about next time. Right? We'll also be doing introductions and conclusions, and talking about recognizing fixed weak thesis statements. Right. See you Thursday.